All right. Hi, my name is Ashley, and I'm here to talk about Angular's digest loop. All right, so we already know that the event loop is like the heart of our JavaScript applications. And when an event is triggered, a callback function is put on the event queue, and an event loop is like very generally what manages this. So Angular extends this functionality by creating its own context. The Angular context is code that runs inside Angular's version of the event loop, which is called the digest loop. So this is code that we've all seen before. We know that when the user types in their name into the input that we've added an ng model to, that Angular will then interpolate that data right in between the handlebars that we have on the page. How does it do this? So this happens because by using ng model, we bind the user's input to the name property on the scope object. So now in order to update the view, Angular needs to track any changes that are made to that property. So what it does is it adds a watch function to the watch list. And watch functions are not added for every property on the scope. They're only added for bound properties. And a bound property is a property that's used in the view. So this is a watch function. This is what it looks like. It takes 3 parameters. The first is an expression or a function that evaluates to a property on the scope. The second is a callback function that will fire off if a change in value has occurred. And the third is an optional Boolean that, when set to true, it tells Angular that if it's given an object, it should compare all of the values on the properties, not just compare the reference. So that like third one is, I think, a little weird to, wrap, or at least it was hard for me to like kind of wrap my mind around. So I just like created, okay, cool, a quick plunker. All right, so just to kind of illustrate that like last point, here's just like something super basic and straightforward. On the first input, I have an ng model with a name, and on the second one, I have an ng model with user.name. And then I have little counters to check how many times it's been updated. So then if I go to app.js, okay, so we look at my controller. I have scope.name set to Ashley, and I have a watch function set on the name property. And then the watch function then compares the new value and the old value, and if they're different, then it'll update the counter. So if I go here, I type in my name, it works. Okay, cool. So user has, I'm doing this very similar thing with scope.user, except scope.user is an object with the name property, and I have that second input box bound to the name property on that scope.user. But if I go here, it doesn't work. And the reason that happens is because right now I'm telling Angular to compare user to the, compare the object's references. But if I add, if I add true here, well, and I redo it, it'll work because now it's telling it to deeply compare like all the values of the properties on that object. Okay, cool. Okay, great. So now we know what a watch function looks like, and we know that for every bound property on the scope, Angular adds one of these to the watch list. So what happens next? Angular will then run a digest cycle and resolve these watch functions through a process called dirty checking. Dirty checking is just like Angular's way of checking whether a value is updated or not. So what Angular does is it loops through the watch list, and it compares each new value to the old value. If it hasn't changed, then it keeps going down the list. But if it has changed, then 3 things will happen. The callback function associated with that expression will be executed. The current value will be changed to the new value, and the expression will be set to dirty, which means that another digest cycle will be triggered. So in this example, we just have like re at fullstack.I is changed to re at fullstack.io. And then we set that email expression to dirty, and then another digest cycle runs. And then Angular will say, okay, well, now there are no dirty expressions here, so I can like stop running the loop. Okay, so this was taken straight from Juke a long time ago. So now, like knowing everything we know about Angular and the digest loop, why doesn't this work? So the problem is that the add event listener on the audio element is triggering a change to scope.progress, but we're not actually triggering a digest loop. So Angular doesn't know that these changes are happening. So great. So now we know we need to trigger a digest loop. How do we do that? All right. So there's digest, obviously. And then there's also apply. And I think we used like eval async once. So which one do we use? Basically, you can use any of these. They all do the same. They all do very similar things, but slightly different. So digest only triggers a reevaluation of the current scope, which is the scope on which digest is called, and any child scopes. And that's just like an example of how you would use it in the add event listener. Apply calls digest on the root scope, which means that all of the expressions that are attached to your scope object or attached to your root scope will be evaluated. So every single expression in the application, basically. Yeah, and then if you look down at the example code, I mean, I saw a lot of people like wrapping their like functions that update their scope variables. They wrapped it in an apply function, but I also saw people just calling apply like without any parameters or anything. So I think it can be used both ways. It's also worth noting that Angular calls apply under the hood when we use directives like ngModel or ngChange or ngClick. And then also, if you use digest or apply heavily in your application, you might get an error that says digest already in progress, which leads us to eval async. So eval async first checks to see if a digest cycle is already occurring, and then it adds all of the expressions that need to be reevaluated to the event queue. So it doesn't actually call a new digest cycle. But if there is no digest cycle occurring, then it will wait 10 milliseconds, and after this time, it will call a new digest cycle in the root scope, and all of your expressions and properties will be reevaluated. So yeah, to sum it up, all properties that are bound to the scope object have watch functions added to the watch list. The digest loop resolves these watch functions through a process called dirty checking. And dirty checking is the way that Angular keeps track of whether a value has been updated or not. And if we're calling a JavaScript function outside of Angular's context, we can trigger a digest loop with digest, apply, or eval async. And here's some cool resources. Thank you.